The evening was grand and golden, filled with the sound of applause echoing through the large concert hall. Every seat was taken, and people stood in the aisles just to get a glimpse of the famous pianist, Alexander Voss. He was known all over Europe as a musical genius, tall, elegant, and always dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His fingers moved over the piano keys like lightning, every note sharp and precise. When he finished his final piece, he stood up slowly, giving a small bow, his face calm but proud. The crowd cheered, whistled, and clapped so loudly that the chandeliers above seemed to tremble. Alexander gave a faint smile, but deep inside, he was not smiling at all. He was satisfied, not because he shared his heart through music, but because he had once again proven that no one could match his skill. To him, music was a competition, and every performance was a victory. He believed emotion was weakness and that art should be about perfection, not feeling. As he walked backstage, a few admirers approached him, asking for autographs and pictures. He nodded politely, pretending to care, but his eyes wandered. He loved the attention, but not the people. To him, most listeners were like background noise, there to applaud, not to understand. In the backstage lounge, a small group of local musicians and journalists gathered around him. One of them, a young man with bright eyes, mentioned a name that Alexander didn't recognize. "Have you heard Clara Moreau play?" he asked excitedly. "She's just a local pianist, but her music, it's something else. She plays in a cafe by the river. No sheet music, no training, just pure feeling. You should listen to her sometime." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "A cafe pianist?" he said with a slight laugh. "And you're comparing her to me?" The room grew quiet. A few people shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Alexander leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Let me guess," he continued. "She charms the crowd with simple tunes and smiles, yes? That may be enough for the untrained ear. But real music, real art comes from discipline and years of study, not emotion or luck." Someone tried to defend Clara, saying that her music made people cry, that she played straight from the heart, but Alexander only laughed louder. "Emotion is for amateurs," he said coldly. "A real pianist doesn't need to cry over the keys. He commands them." The word spread quickly through the town. By the next morning, everyone was talking about what Alexander had said. In cafes, on buses, in schools, people repeated his cruel remarks. Some defended him, saying he was right. Others were angry, especially those who had heard Clara play. Clara herself heard about it 2 days later. She was sitting in her small apartment above a flower shop, giving a piano lesson to one of her students when her friend Elise came rushing in, holding a newspaper. "Did you see what he said?" Elise exclaimed. "That big-shot pianist Alexander Voss. He said you're just an amateur, that you play for fun, not art." Clara looked up, surprised but calm. She didn't like gossip, but she could see the hurt in her friend's eyes. "It's all right," she said softly. "He doesn't know me." But that night, when the shop below closed and the street grew quiet, Clara sat at her old piano and thought about those words. She wasn't angry, and she was curious. What kind of man thought emotion was weakness? What kind of artist believed beauty could be measured by speed or precision? She touched the worn keys and began to play a gentle melody, one she had written long ago when her mother was sick. Each note carried warmth, sorrow, and memory. As the music filled the small room, Clara closed her eyes. This was what she understood as music. Not perfection, but truth. Meanwhile, Alexander was invited to a private dinner with the mayor and other guests. During the meal, someone mentioned that Clara had accepted a challenge to play against him in a friendly piano duel. Alexander almost choked on his drink, then laughed so hard that tears formed in his eyes. "A duel?" he said mockingly. "Well, why not? Let the people have their little show. I'll remind them what real talent sounds like." Everyone laughed with him, but a few faces showed discomfort. They could see his arrogance had no limits. In the days that followed, posters appeared across town. Alexander Voss versus Clara Moreau, the duel of skill and soul. The idea captured everyone's imagination. It was like a story come to life, the proud master against the humble artist. The newspapers loved it, calling it the clash of two worlds. Some supported Alexander, saying technique would always win. Others secretly hoped Clara would surprise him. As the concert date approached, excitement filled the air. The hall where Alexander had once played alone would now host something entirely different, not just a performance, but a test of heart. And while Alexander spent his days practicing scales and perfecting every note, Clara continued to play in her quiet room, surrounded by the scent of flowers from the shop below. She didn't change her ways. She didn't buy a fancy dress or hire a coach. She only played the way she always did, honestly, as if speaking to the piano like an old friend. Deep down, she knew something Alexander had forgotten long ago. Music is not a battle to be won, but a story to be shared. And though neither of them realized it yet, that story, their story, was only just beginning. Clara Moreau lived a quiet life in a small town that smelled of coffee, old books, and fresh flowers. Her little apartment was above a flower shop owned by her friend Elise. Every morning, she would open her window, let the soft air in, and listen to the street below. Children running to school, the florist arranging roses, the old man sweeping the cobblestones. To most people, these were just everyday sounds, but to Clara, they were music. Her piano sat in the corner of the room near the sunlight. It was old and slightly worn, with a few scratches and one key that didn't sound quite right. But to her it was perfect. She had played that piano since she was a girl, through good days, lonely nights, and everything in between. It had become part of her life, like a heartbeat. Unlike Alexander Voss, who had trained under famous teachers and performed on grand stages, Clara had never studied in a music academy. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a baker. The piano came from a second-hand shop, bought with her mother's savings after seeing how her daughter's eyes sparkled every time she heard music. Clara taught herself by listening and feeling. She didn't read notes perfectly, but she could hear a song once and play it back as if she had known it all her life. She taught children from the neighborhood, little hands pressing the wrong keys, laughing at their mistakes. She never scolded them. Instead, she told them, "Music is like talking. You just have to find your own voice." Her lessons were full of warmth and encouragement. Some students came even when they had no money, and she still taught them because she believed music should never be locked behind price or pride. After the news about Alexander's insult spread, everyone in town started talking to her about it. The baker, the librarian, even the postman had something to say. Some were angry for her, some just curious, but Clara stayed calm. She didn't like drama and she didn't want to prove anything. Still, the whispers grew louder each day. "You should show him what real feeling sounds like. You can beat him, Clara." One evening, she was closing her window when Elise came running upstairs, breathless and excited. "He agreed," Elise shouted. "Who?" Clara asked, confused. "Alexander Voss, the duel." "It's official. The mayor himself will host it at the Grand Hall." Clara's eyes widened. "The Grand Hall? That's too much," she said softly. "I only play for small crowds, not—" Elise interrupted. "Not for kings, I know. But this isn't about pride. This is about showing that your kind of music matters too." Clara sighed and looked at her piano. She didn't want to fight, but deep down she felt a small fire spark inside her. Not anger, but purpose. She had spent her whole life believing that music came from the heart, and now someone had called that idea foolish. Maybe she thought it was time to let her heart speak for itself. That night she sat at her piano longer than usual. The street outside was quiet except for the soft hum of a streetlight. Her fingers moved gently over the keys, playing a melody that sounded like a story. Slow at first, then rising, filled with longing and warmth. It was not perfect, but it was honest. As she played, she imagined standing on that grand stage, not as a competitor, but as a voice for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Meanwhile, Alexander Voss sat in a luxury hotel in the city. He had received the official invitation to the duel and laughed as he read it. "A duel against a cafe pianist?" he muttered, sipping his wine. "It will be good entertainment for the crowd." He imagined how he would end the evening, with applause, headlines, and another victory for his ego. He had no idea how deeply this simple woman would change him. The next morning, the town buzzed with excitement. The posters went up everywhere, outside bakeries, schools, and even the train station. Piano duel, the elitist versus the dreamer. Children ran around chanting Clara's name while older townsfolk argued in cafes about who would win. The air felt electric, like something big was about to happen. Clara tried to ignore the attention. She continued her daily routine, teaching, shopping for bread, feeding the stray cat that slept by her window. But inside her a quiet nervousness grew. She wasn't used to performing in front of hundreds of people. Sometimes, late at night, she'd stare at her reflection in the piano lid and whisper, "What if I fail?" Her old piano seemed to whisper back through its slightly uneven notes, "Just be you." In the days leading up to the duel, Clara didn't change her style or practice fancy pieces. Instead, she worked on her emotions, remembering her childhood, her parents, the people she loved and lost. She played their memories through her fingers, letting her heart guide her rhythm. Elise often sat beside her, closing her eyes, listening. "When you play," she said once, "it feels like time stops." Clara smiled. "That's how I know I'm doing it right." As the evening of the duel drew closer, both pianists prepared in their own worlds, one surrounded by mirrors and pride, the other surrounded by flowers and dreams. But though they lived in opposite worlds, fate was gently pulling them together, like two melodies that would soon meet in a breathtaking harmony. Neither of them knew it yet. But when Clara's hands would touch the keys on that stage, everything, fame, pride, and status, would fade away. Only music would remain. The news of the piano duel spread faster than anyone expected. Within just a few days, it was all anyone could talk about, from the small-town bakery to the elegant city cafes. People argued, laughed, and whispered about what would happen when Alexander Voss, the famous pianist of perfect skill, faced Clara Moreau, the humble woman who played from the heart. Posters covered every wall. The duel of skill and soul, Alexander Voss versus Clara Moreau. Below the title was a picture of the grand hall, its shining chandeliers and long red curtains promising a night to remember. Tickets sold out within hours. Even the mayor couldn't believe how much excitement it caused. "It's more than a concert," he told the press. "It's a story about pride and passion." Alexander was enjoying every bit of the attention. In his mind, the duel wasn't a risk. It was an opportunity to remind people that no one could reach his level. During interviews, he smiled charmingly and said, "It's good to encourage local musicians, of course. Music is for everyone. But there's a difference between playing notes and understanding them." The reporters laughed politely, sensing the arrogance behind his words. He spent his days practicing long hours, perfecting the same classical pieces he had played hundreds of times before. Each note was flawless, cold, and exact, just as he liked it. His assistant asked him if he was nervous. Alexander looked up with a confident grin. "Nervous? I've played for kings. I've performed in Vienna and Rome. I could do this duel blindfolded." But though he pretended not to care, something about the situation bothered him. Who was this woman who had suddenly captured so much attention? Why were people calling her the heart of music? Why did her name sound on everyone's lips with such warmth? He didn't understand it, and that confusion turned slowly into irritation. Meanwhile, Clara's world remained quiet and simple, but it was changing in its own way. Children knocked on her door asking for autographs. Strangers left flowers by her piano. She smiled kindly but stayed humble, always saying, "I'm no celebrity. I'm just someone who loves to play." Still, deep inside, she felt a growing pressure. This duel wasn't just about her anymore. It had become a symbol for everyone who believed that feelings mattered more than fame. Elise, her closest friend, tried to calm her nerves. "Don't think of it as a fight," she said one afternoon as they drank tea by the window. "Think of it as sharing who you are." Clara nodded. "That's what I want. I don't want to defeat him. I just want him to hear, really hear, what music can be when it's alive." The day of the event drew nearer and the whole town prepared for it like it was a festival. Shops closed early. Students skipped lessons. Even travelers from nearby cities came to see what people were calling the concert of the decade. On the morning of the duel, the grand hall was polished to perfection. Chandeliers sparkled, rows of golden chairs gleamed, and a massive black grand piano stood at the center of the stage, reflecting the ceiling lights like a mirror. Musicians, critics, and journalists filled the seats, whispering their predictions. Some said Clara didn't stand a chance. Others believed that her emotion might move the crowd more than his perfection ever could. Backstage, Alexander stood before a mirror, straightening his white bow tie. His reflection looked flawless, confident, charming, and calm. But deep down, a small voice of unease whispered something he couldn't ignore. He shook it off. "She's just a local amateur," he told himself. "I've done this 1,000 times." A few doors away, Clara sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. She wore a simple dress with light colors that reminded one of spring. Her heart beat fast, but her eyes were peaceful. She whispered to herself, "Play with honesty, not fear." Elise hugged her tightly before leaving for her seat in the audience. "Remember," she said, "you're not here to win. You're here to touch hearts." When the lights dimmed, the crowd fell silent. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's extraordinary event, a duel between two remarkable artists, the world-famous Alexander Voss and our beloved Clara Moreau." The audience clapped, some cheering for Alexander's fame, others shouting Clara's name. Alexander went first. He walked to the piano with slow, confident steps like a king returning to his throne. Sitting down, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written. His fingers flew over the keys like lightning, his timing perfect, his posture flawless. The sound filled the hall like a storm, fast, powerful, breathtaking. When he finished, the crowd roared with applause. He stood, bowed deeply, and smiled proudly. Backstage, Clara closed her eyes. She could still feel his thunder in her chest. For a moment, her hands trembled, but then she took a deep breath. She remembered her students, her old piano, the smell of flowers from her window, and all the little moments that made her love music. She whispered, "Now it's my turn." As she walked onto the stage, the room grew quiet again. She didn't carry sheet music. She didn't bow grandly. She simply sat down and touched the piano gently, as if greeting an old friend. And though no one knew it yet, in just a few moments, the world inside that hall would change forever. The hall was so quiet that you could hear the faint rustle of dresses and the sound of someone breathing in the audience. Clara Moreau sat at the piano, her hands resting softly on the keys, her heart beating fast but steady. The lights above her seemed gentler now, not harsh or blinding, but warm, like sunlight through a window. She didn't look at the crowd or at Alexander sitting nearby. She closed her eyes for a brief second and whispered to herself, "Just feel." Her fingers began to move. The first note was soft, almost a whisper. Then came another, and another, weaving together into a melody that seemed to float in the air like a memory. It wasn't a famous piece or a show of skill. It was something else, something deeply human. Her music sounded like laughter and tears mixed together. It rose and fell like breathing, like the rhythm of life itself. People leaned forward in their seats. Some had expected mistakes or nervousness, but instead, they felt something they couldn't explain, a strange warmth spreading through the room. Her playing wasn't perfect in a technical way. Some notes were slightly uneven, her timing natural but free, yet every note carried feeling. It was as if the piano had come alive, whispering secrets straight into their hearts. Alexander sat still, his confident smile fading slowly. He didn't understand what was happening. This wasn't the kind of playing he respected. No flashy runs, no fast tempo, no grand gestures. But the longer he listened, the more uneasy he felt. Her sound touched places his music never reached. He felt something stir inside him. Something uncomfortable, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For the first time in a long while, he was listening. Clara's melody grew stronger. She didn't look at the audience once. Her mind drifted to her memories. Her mother baking bread early in the morning. Her father fixing a broken radio while humming softly. The laughter of her students when they finally played their first song right. All those moments poured out through her hands. She wasn't trying to win or impress anyone. She was simply telling her story, a story made of love, struggle, and hope. In the audience, people began to cry quietly. Even those who had come expecting to mock her were silent now, caught in the spell of her sincerity. A child sitting in the front row whispered to his mother, "It sounds like she's talking." When the piece ended, Clara let the final note linger. It hung in the air like a breath that refused to end. Then she lifted her hands and the hall stayed completely silent for several seconds. No one dared to move. And then, suddenly, the silence broke. Applause thundered through the room. People stood cheering, clapping, shouting her name. Flowers were thrown onto the stage and tears glistened in the lights. Clara looked around, surprised, almost shy. She smiled gently, placed her hand over her heart and bowed once. Alexander didn't clap right away. His chest felt heavy. He stared at her, realizing something painful. He stared at her, realizing something painful. Her music wasn't about technique or control. It was about truth, and truth couldn't be practiced or learned. It had to be lived. When the applause finally calmed, the announcer stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we have witnessed tonight is not just a competition. It is the meeting of two souls." The crowd clapped again, but this time softer, more respectful. Alexander stood slowly and approached Clara. The audience fell silent again, sensing something important was about to happen. He extended his hand. His face looked different now, not proud or arrogant, but humbled. "That was," he began, but the words caught in his throat. He cleared it and tried again. "That was beautiful, Miss Moreau, truly." Clara smiled kindly and shook his hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "You play beautifully too, Mr. Voss, but maybe you play for perfection." "I just play for people." Her words struck him like a quiet bell inside his mind. He nodded slowly, unable to answer. After the duel, backstage was filled with chatter and flashing cameras. Reporters surrounded both pianists, shouting questions. "Do you admit she won?" one journalist asked Alexander directly. He paused for a long time before replying. "Music isn't something you can win or lose," he said finally. "It's something you feel. And tonight I was reminded of that." Clara, standing beside him, looked at him with gentle eyes. There was no pride in her face, and only peace. She wasn't thinking about victory or fame. She was thinking about how happy she was to have shared something real. When the crowd finally left and the lights dimmed, Alexander stayed behind, alone in the empty hall. The grand piano stood under the soft glow of a single lamp. He walked over and touched the keys slowly, pressing one note. The sound echoed softly in the emptiness. It felt different now. Not sharp, not cold, but alive. For the first time in years, he didn't play to impress. He played to feel. The melody that came out was hesitant, unsure, but honest. And as it filled the quiet hall, he smiled faintly. He finally understood what Clara had meant. Somewhere in the distance outside the hall, Clara was walking home, her shoes clicking softly against the stone road. She didn't look back, but she could still hear faint music drifting from the hall. Gentle, imperfect, and full of soul. And though she didn't know it, she had changed not only a man's way of playing, but also his heart. The duel was over, but the story was far from finished. The music had stopped hours ago, yet the echoes still lingered, not just in the hall, but in the hearts of everyone who had been there. That night, the city was alive with talk. Cafes buzzed with excitement. Newspapers printed extra editions, and people stood in groups on the streets, replaying every moment. Some talked about Alexander's flawless skill. Others couldn't stop talking about Clara, about the way her music had made them feel, about the tears that had come without warning. At first, Alexander stayed in his dressing room long after everyone had gone. He sat in silence, staring at his hands. Those same hands that had earned him fame and fortune now felt strangely heavy. He tried to smile at his reflection, but it didn't look like him anymore. He had played perfectly that night, yet for the first time, perfection didn't feel like victory. He could still hear her music in his mind, like a soft whisper he couldn't shut out. It followed him, through the quiet hallways into the dark streets, even as he returned to his hotel. It wasn't a melody he could copy or repeat. It was something alive, something that came from a place he had long forgotten. Across town, Clara sat in her small apartment above the flower shop. The scent of roses drifted through the open window. She still wore her concert dress, her hair slightly undone. Elise sat beside her, smiling through tears. "You did it, Clara," she whispered. "You made them all feel something real." Clara shook her head gently. "It wasn't about winning," she said softly. "It was about showing that music isn't just for the rich or the trained. It's for everyone who has ever felt joy or pain. It belongs to all of us," Elise nodded. "Maybe. But tonight you reminded even the great Alexander Voss what it means to play with a soul." The next morning, newspaper headlines filled the city. Clara Moreau stuns the elite. Heart defeats perfection in Grand Hall duel. Alexander Voss silenced by simplicity. The public adored the story. The humble teacher versus the proud master. The small-town dreamer who made the world cry. Journalists called Clara the soul pianist. Children sent her letters with crayon drawings of her at the piano. But Clara didn't let it change her. She still walked to the flower shop each morning, still taught her students with the same kindness. Fame didn't interest her. Music did. Alexander, on the other hand, couldn't escape the noise. Every interview, every headline, every whisper reminded him of that moment on stage. He tried to laugh it off, to tell people it was just a friendly match. But deep down, he knew that something inside him had shifted forever. A few days later, he went back to the concert hall alone. The janitor was cleaning the floors when he entered. The man looked surprised to see him. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you left quite an impression last week. But that woman—" "I know," Alexander said quietly, cutting him off. He sat down at the same piano they had played on. For a long while he just stared at it, the polished surface, the reflection of his tired face. Then slowly he began to play. Not Liszt, not Beethoven, just something soft and unplanned. A melody without rules, without perfection, full of feeling. It sounded rough, uncertain, but honest. The janitor stopped sweeping and listened. When Alexander finished, he looked up and smiled faintly. "It's not perfect," he said. The janitor chuckled. "Maybe that's why it's beautiful." That night, Alexander wrote a letter. His handwriting was neat but hesitant. "Dear Miss Moreau, I owe you an apology. Not for challenging you, but for misunderstanding music itself. For years I've played to prove I was the best. You reminded me that music doesn't exist for pride. It exists to speak when words cannot. If you ever agree, I would like to learn, not as a master, but as a student. With respect, Alexander Voss." He sealed the letter and sent it the next morning. When Clara received it, she was in the middle of a lesson with one of her students. She smiled as she read it, quietly folding the paper and placing it on the piano. Her student looked up curiously. "Who was that from?" the little girl asked. "A friend," Clara said gently. "One who finally learned to listen." Days turned into weeks. People still spoke of the duel, but for both Alexander and Clara, it had become something more private, a memory that changed them in ways no audience could see. One evening, months later, Alexander performed again, but differently. He didn't wear the proud smile he once had. He didn't rush or show off. His hands moved softly, each note carrying warmth and vulnerability. The critics wrote that it was the most emotional performance of his career. And in a small town not far away, Clara sat by her window, listening to a recording of that concert playing on the radio. She recognized something in his tone, something new. She closed her eyes and smiled, whispering, "You found it." Outside, the evening breeze carried the faint scent of flowers and music. Somewhere between perfection and feeling, two pianists, once strangers, once rivals, had finally begun to play the same song, the song of understanding. Weeks passed after the duel, but for Alexander Voss, time felt slower. The applause that had once filled his world now seemed like an echo from another life. Every time he sat at the piano, he heard not his own perfection, but her melody, soft, emotional, haunting. It was like a ghost that refused to leave him. He tried to go back to his old routines, concerts, interviews, rehearsals, but something was missing. When he played, the music sounded empty. The notes were still perfect, but the feeling was gone. Crowds still cheered for him, but he noticed something he had never seen before. Their applause didn't reach his heart. It was just noise. One night after a performance in Paris, Alexander sat alone in his hotel room. The city lights shimmered outside, but he barely noticed them. He took off his bow tie and stared at his hands. For years, these hands had been praised as miraculous and divine, unmatched. Now they just felt tired. He pressed his fingers against the table, pretending it was a piano, and played a silent tune only he could hear. It wasn't one of his famous pieces, and it was Clara's. The simple rhythm echoed in his mind. He could still see her, sitting calmly on the stage, eyes closed, lost in her music. He remembered the audience's tears, the way they had listened to her as if she were telling their own stories through sound, and for the first time he felt something painful yet honest: regret. He regretted not listening sooner. He regretted thinking that skill was greater than soul. He regretted that all his fame had never made anyone cry the way she did with a single melody. A few days later, Alexander canceled all his upcoming shows. His manager was shocked. "Are you serious?" he exclaimed. "You're at the height of your career. People are begging for more concerts." Alexander simply replied, "Maybe that's the problem." He packed a small bag, took the first train out of Paris, and went to the small town where Clara lived. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't even know what he would say. He just knew he needed to see her again. Not as a rival, not as a master, but as a man who had finally learned to listen. When he arrived, the town looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. He walked past the flower shop beneath her apartment, the scent of roses in the air. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. Elise, arranging flowers, looked up and gasped. "Mr. Voss?" she said, surprised. "You're here?" He smiled awkwardly. "I was hoping to speak with Miss Moreau, if she'll see me." Elise hesitated for a moment, then nodded and led him upstairs. She knocked gently on Clara's door. "Clara, you have a visitor." When the door opened, Clara stood there in a simple dress, her hands still dusted with flour from baking. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, but she didn't look angry, just surprised. "Mr. Voss," she said softly. "I didn't expect—" He interrupted quietly. "Please, call me Alexander." There was an awkward silence before she smiled faintly and invited him in. He looked around her small apartment, the piano in the corner, the soft light from the window, the smell of bread and flowers. It felt warm, alive, everything his luxurious apartment in Paris wasn't. "I came to thank you," he said, his voice low, "and to apologize. That night changed me." Clara tilted her head slightly. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do," he insisted. "I spent years chasing perfection, but you showed me something I never understood. That music isn't about control. It's about feeling, about honesty." She looked at him kindly. "It's never too late to remember that." He glanced at her piano. "May I?" She nodded. Alexander sat down and touched the keys. At first his fingers hesitated, as if afraid. Then slowly he began to play. The sound was gentle, imperfect, but sincere. Clara watched quietly, noticing how different he looked, softer, humbler, real. When he finished, he laughed nervously. "It's not flawless," he said. Clara smiled. "Good," she replied. "Now it sounds human." They both laughed, softly, like two old friends sharing a secret. For the first time, Alexander felt light, as if a weight had lifted from his heart. They spent the afternoon talking about music, life, their childhoods. Alexander told her about the loneliness behind his fame, the pressure to always be the best. Clara shared stories about her students, about how she found beauty in small mistakes that led to something new. When evening came, he stood to leave. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for everything. You taught me more in one night than years of study ever did." Clara looked at him with gentle eyes. "Then promise me something," she said. "Anything. Never stop feeling mess, even if it makes your music messy. The world has enough perfect notes. It needs real ones." He nodded slowly. "I promise." As he walked away from her home, the last light of sunset painted the town in gold. He could hear faint music behind him, Clara playing by her window. This time he didn't feel envy or regret. He felt gratitude. He had finally learned what music and in life were truly about. The days after Alexander's visit to Clara felt different, lighter, slower, almost peaceful. For years he had lived in the fast rhythm of applause, airports, and bright lights. Now he woke up to birdsong and quiet mornings. He stayed in the little town for a while, walking by the river, buying bread from the same bakery Clara did, and spending evenings listening to street musicians instead of performing for huge crowds. People recognized him, of course. Some whispered, wondering why the great Alexander Voss was still there. Others approached shyly for autographs. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel proud when people called his name. He just smiled politely and kept walking. He wasn't Alexander the celebrity anymore. He was simply Alexander, a man trying to find himself. Every few days he visited Clara. Sometimes they talked for hours over tea. Sometimes they said nothing and just played music together. Their duets were unlike anything he had ever experienced. Clara's playing was gentle and full of emotion, while his was careful and precise, but somehow the two styles blended beautifully, like opposites completing each other. One afternoon, as they finished playing, Clara looked at him and said softly, "You play differently now." Alexander smiled faintly. "I listen now," he replied. "Before I only performed." She nodded, understanding. "When you listen, even silence becomes music." They both laughed quietly at that, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Word of Alexander's change began to spread. Critics who had once called him the flawless machine now noticed something new in his performances. When he returned to the stage months later, his audience saw a different man. He didn't rush to impress. His movements were calmer, his expression softer. When he played, people felt something genuine, something warm. At his first concert after the Duel, the hall was full, as always. The audience expected brilliance, and they got it, but not in the way they imagined. Instead of starting with a famous classical piece, Alexander played a simple melody, a piece Clara had written. It was quiet and emotional, nothing flashy or technical. The audience listened, stunned. Some even cried. When the last note faded, the hall stayed silent, just as it had during Clara's performance months earlier. Then came the applause, thunderous, sincere, endless. After the concert, journalists rushed backstage. Mr. Voss, one asked, "Your music feels different now." "What changed?" Alexander smiled humbly. "I stopped playing to be admired," he said. "Now I play to be understood." He didn't mention Clara by name, but everyone knew. Articles began to appear calling her the muse who awakened a maestro. Photographers even visited her little town asking for interviews. But Clara always refused politely. "Music speaks for itself," she'd say. Still, the two of them stayed in touch. They exchanged letters when Alexander traveled, sharing thoughts about music and life. His letters were always thoughtful, full of gratitude. "You taught me that silence is as powerful as sound," one letter said. "Your melody reminds me to breathe." Clara kept those letters folded neatly inside a music book by her piano. Sometimes she read them before teaching her students, smiling quietly to herself. She wasn't in love with his fame or charm. What she admired was his change, the courage it took to let go of pride and start again. One rainy evening months later, Alexander returned to visit her again. The streets glistened with reflections, and the air smelled of wet roses from the shop below. When she opened the door, he looked different, less polished, more human. He carried a small box under his arm. "I brought you something," he said. Inside the box was a sheet of music, handwritten. At the top it read, "For Clara, the melody of second chances." "It's not perfect," he said, smiling nervously, "but it's yours. I wrote it after our last duet." Clara traced the notes with her fingers, her eyes soft. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You found your own voice," he looked down, his voice low. "You helped me find it." They sat at the piano and played the piece together, her gentle touch guiding his deeper tones. The melody told their story without a single word, pride, humility, friendship, and redemption all woven into sound. When they finished, neither spoke for a while. The only sound was the soft rain outside. Finally, Clara said, "You know, Alexander, music is strange. It doesn't belong to those who are best at it. It belongs to those who love it the most." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then it belongs to you." She smiled, shaking her head. "No, it belongs to both of us, and now that we both understand it." He laughed quietly. "I suppose you're right." That night, as he walked back to his inn, he heard the echo of their melody in the rain. The notes felt alive, like a heartbeat. Imperfect, human, beautiful. He stopped under a street lamp and looked up at the dark sky, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. Fame, applause, reputation, all of it felt small now. What mattered was the connection he had found. Not just with Clara, but with himself, with the world, and with the music he had once used as a shield. Somewhere in that small town, under the same rain, Clara sat by her piano, smiling as she played the last few bars of his new piece. Their melodies were different, yet somehow, they always found their way back to harmony. It wasn't the end of their story, not just a quieter, more meaningful beginning. Months passed quietly after that rainy evening when Alexander gave Clara his song. The world slowly moved on from the famous duel that had once filled the newspapers. New stories replaced it. New stars appeared. But for those who had been there, the memory never faded. For Alexander and Clara, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. They stayed in touch, sharing letters and sometimes visiting each other. Fame still followed Alexander wherever he went, but he no longer lived for it. He had stopped chasing perfection and started searching for truth, not only in music but in life. When he played now, the audience could feel something deep and real. His notes were slower, warmer. People said his music had changed, that it made them feel instead of just admire. Critics called it his rebirth. But Alexander always smiled and said quietly, "It wasn't a rebirth. It was a reminder." He never told the world who had reminded him. He didn't need to. Those who listened closely could sense her in his music, a gentleness that hadn't been there before, a spark of soul that sounded like Clara. One spring morning, Alexander returned to the small town again. The streets were full of color, flower stalls blooming, children running, the smell of bread in the air. He walked to the familiar flower shop and found Clara arranging tulips by the window. When she saw him, her face lit up in surprise and joy. "Alexander," she said. "You came back," he smiled. "I told you I would. Paris feels too loud without your music." She laughed softly. "I'm sure Paris survives without me." "Perhaps," he said, "but I don't." They sat together with tea like old friends. Alexander told her about his new performances, how he had started teaching young musicians, encouraging them to play from emotion rather than pride. "They remind me of your students," he said. "I tell them that the piano doesn't belong to those who master it. It belongs to those who listen to it." Clara nodded, pleased. "You've learned well," she said teasingly. He grinned. "From the best." That afternoon they walked to the grand hall, the very place where their duel had taken place. It was empty now, quiet, the red curtains faded a little with time. Dust floated in the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. Alexander looked around with a strange tenderness. "This is where everything changed," he murmured. Clara smiled softly. "For both of us." They sat at the same piano side by side. Neither said a word. Clara began playing first, going to calm, gentle tune, almost like a memory. Alexander joined her slowly, his notes weaving between hers, soft and respectful. The two melodies merged perfectly, like they were meant to find each other. It wasn't a duel this time. It was a conversation between two souls who had once stood on opposite sides of pride and humility, now united through understanding. When they finished, silence filled the hall once again, just like that night months ago. Only this time there was no crowd, no applause, just peace. Clara looked at him and said quietly, "You've changed so much, Alexander." He smiled. "Because you showed me what I was missing." She tilted her head. "And what was that?" He looked down at the keys, pressing one softly. "Heart." There was a long pause, not awkward but full of meaning. The kind of silence that says everything words cannot. Years later, when people spoke about Alexander Voss, they no longer called him the elitist pianist. They called him the soulful one. His concerts became known not for their perfection, but for their emotion. And in every performance, he always played one song last, the melody of second chances. He never announced who it was for. But in a quiet town far away, Clara Moreau always knew. She would stop whatever she was doing, sit by her window, and listen to the distant sound of his music through the radio. Her students would sometimes ask, "Miss Clara, do you ever miss performing on big stages?" She would smile and shake her head. "No," she'd say. "I've already played the most important song of my life." And when they asked her what that song was, she would look out the window, where sunlight touched the old piano keys, and whisper, "The one that changed a heart." Sometimes, late at night, she'd still play that melody, the one she had played during the duel. The notes would float out into the quiet streets, soft and timeless. And somewhere across cities and concert halls, Alexander would feel it, like a distant heartbeat calling him home. Their music never truly ended. It lived on, in every student who played without fear, in every listener who closed their eyes and felt instead of judged, and in every imperfect note that carried love instead of pride. Two pianists, once divided by arrogance and simplicity, had become part of the same song, a song that reminded the world that true art isn't about being better than others. It's about being honest with yourself, and as long as someone somewhere played with heart, their melody would never fade.